Who wants to do it?
I don't know the intro.
I don't know the intro, but I just wing it every week. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Osint Bunker podcast. It is episode 6, and honestly, it has been a fairly quiet last 2 weeks, which, honestly, we're happy about. Let's just say that we are genuinely. I know it normally means less news for us to talk about, but when you get to actually deal with less of the crazy stuff, it is. We appreciate that so much more.
Yeah, sometimes no news is very,
It's
very
good.
good news.
No news is good news.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gives us a chance to sort of, take a step back, reevaluate everything that, all the other stuff that's been going on that isn't, let's say just in our face. Of course, Carrier Strike Group 21 getting underway. I know you guys really wanted to talk about that, and I of course wanted to sort of hit on briefly before we just get started. Of course, we have to talk about Ukraine. It does seem like Russia is pulling back. That is one thing that we definitely are starting to see. It looks like they're going to be mostly pulling back troops at the moment. Obviously, that's the most expensive thing to keep in the area. They do seem to be, leaving some equipment behind, but at least for now, the episode of, extreme brinkmanship, the threat of invasion has mostly passed.
Mm.
But, going into the future, obviously, Russia sort of discovered the limit of what they could do, and the NATO certainly laid a line in the sand, at least I think, from what we can
Yeah,
see.
I think it was mostly verbal from NATO, which we kind of expected anyway. We weren't really expecting to see troops start moving towards Ukraine, um, but I think it's been interesting as well because while there have been some NATO nations have been very, very vocal, very public about their thoughts on it. Generally speaking, NATO itself has stayed relatively quiet, at least in public. And I do have to wonder how much has been said behind the scenes, how many phone calls have been made to the Kremlin. Um, you know, we talk about the hotline between the US and the Kremlin, and I do believe that has been in use in this instance, but we probably won't find out to what extent for a good many years to come.
Yeah, it does look like a summit between Biden and Putin will be coming together at least over the summer. That is definitely something that came out of this.
It came out of it, but to be honest, it seems more than anything just to be a symbolic summit, just to basically tick it off and done. As basically it was offered as offered as essentially we'll have a talk if you stop what you're doing, and so the actual summit itself, I don't think anything will come of it. I think it's merely basically a symbolic and sort of very very much mundane diplomatic move.
Definitely that is part of it, and as John said, a lot of the stuff is happening in the background. I'm absolutely sure. Um, but what we can see, at least from the surface level right now, is it is mostly over, but the status quo has definitely changed a bit. Um, there's a lot more equipment in the area, and Russia's sort of established how far they're willing to go, at least right now. With, of course, moving equipment into the region, moving troops into the region, and sort of, you know, I'm not exactly sure what their entire goal was there, because it obviously wasn't cheap. It cost them
No.
a lot to do this, both in political capital and just regular money.
And just think
Um,
about economic cost as well. The requisitioned train uses from farmers as well, so it's clearly hit their economy and hit food stocks and food. It would have had an effect on food deliveries.
yeah, I'm sort of confused what their goal was. Um, it just it doesn't really make sense what they were sort of aiming at achieving here, because we already sort of knew where the red line was. It was Russia moving troops across the border into Ukraine. That's pretty much where we knew it was, but I guess the Russians tested what NATO's political response would be. I don't see the reason for
I
all the
think you
capital
kind of
spent.
I think you kind of alluded to it earlier. It's more a case of Russia was seeing how much equipment they could move to the border of NATO before there was a major fuss kicked up. Because, as we pointed out last time we did this, there was no secret about the amount of equipment moving to the border. Even we could see how much kit was being moved to the border via satellite imagery, commercially available, via people on the ground filming the trains, the tanks and stuff on them, driving past. So it wasn't, I think for Russia, it was more a case of, well, how much kit can we move before, Western leaders actually start taking notice and start kicking off about it.
And
How much can we play around the lion's tail before it starts to get annoyed?
I think an important thing as well is whenever America does elect a new president, Russia does like to see how far they can push, they can push that particular leader, so they know, well, this is the scope we can operate with it in for the next 4 years.
Oh, and the Biden administration certainly is bringing people in who are far more hawkish on Russia.
There's proper responses being given to Russia's action rather than just something to grab media's attention. There's an actual serious diplomatic responses given.
Yeah, I mean, we saw, diplomats being sent home. We saw, active reconnaissance flights daily, multiple assets, at the same time. So we're definitely providing the Ukrainians with as much material support as we possibly could at the time. And we're seeing more supplies being sent there as well. It comes back to, perhaps they were distracting domestically from the Navalny issues. That is a possibility. I don't think Putin thinks he has that thin or that weak of a control over his own people.
And of course, we've still got this ongoing diplomatic issue between Russia and several of the Eastern European countries, with obviously the revelations from Bellingcat and their own internal investigations, thinking particularly about that 2014 explosion, which has now been attributed to the same two Russian spies who were involved in the Salisbury Novichok poisonings.
As well, obviously, you had the Czech diplomats going back and forth as well. I mean, the Czechs as well asked for a more unified response from Europe, and well, they don't really seem to have gotten that. Many countries have kind of shushed about it, really.
Yeah, well, we're seeing different levels of response from different places. Obviously, in the Czech Republic, we're seeing a very distinct response. The UK was prepared to sail CSG-21 into the Mediterranean if they had to. So I guess we sort of saw a piecemeal response, but just not this unified response, which I guess possibly Russia was probing at to see, how unified will NATO be on the issue. And NATO, fairly obviously, each country took their own, individual response, and there wasn't as much of a unified one.
Things like NATO has different responses when it's obviously involved in a non-NATO member, and even when it doesn't involve a NATO member, if it's not a direct sort of hostile military action, the responses tend to sometimes be a bit all over the place. But I still think, regardless if it's an actual direct military action taken against any NATO member, a unified response from NATO, I think, you can pretty much guarantee it.
Oh, obviously, and we're sort of back to this Cold War status quo. Where it's basically NATO versus Russia and the, at least stable of countries that Russia is building up. Not so much as the Warsaw Pact anymore, but definitely, sort of a confederation that they're putting together that, is quickly growing closer and closer. And obviously the situation in Belarus is probably going to end in Russian annexation in the next few years. But, we're just seeing this, I don't know, snowball and sort of descend back into these, 1980s style confrontations. And as I always said, the 1980s were bad. Sure, there was always that constant threat of nuclear war, but the velocity of escalation wasn't really changing. It was sort of just staying the same. But now we're sort of seeing, just things ramp up and ramp up and ramp up quicker and quicker and quicker. And it's a lot different than it was during the Cold War, where, the some of the worst tensions in the Cold War were during the 1950s and early 1960s, when we saw that escalation sort of ramp up very quickly. Suez crisis, the multiple crises in Berlin, and then of course the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think definitely velocity of escalation is the thing to look at least right now.
And I think it's worth as well just mentioning that it's not quite as clear cut as NATO versus Russia anymore either, because we've obviously got nations like Turkey and Iraq, and some of those neighbouring countries in sort of Eastern Europe and into Asia, who are now kind of on the border. They're allies to one side at one moment in time, but they're also a lot allies to the other side in different circumstances.
So the one thing that we can rely on,
oddball.
I think the one thing we can rely on is in a NATO versus Russia situation, Turkey probably is going to side with NATO, just historical reasons, animosity with Russia, and current reasons. They're most likely to focus on their own territory first in that situation, but closing off something like the Bosphorus to shipping is going to hurt Russia a lot more than it would hurt NATO.
Massively. I mean, obviously it limits the NATO states of Romania and Bulgaria moving shipping out, but obviously their navies isn't really that of a significant asset, and obviously it hurts NATO getting into it, but NATO could quite literally conduct missions quite safely from the Mediterranean.
I think it all just comes down to this question of, where is Russia going to stop, and how far is NATO willing to go? Is NATO willing to resolve the issue, in eastern Ukraine? Probably not. Can Ukraine...
I think NATO's pretty adamant that the situation in eastern Ukraine with the Donbass is a matter for Ukraine themselves to handle, as opposed to Crimea, which is a sort of a territorial dispute with larger ramifications.
Yeah. And well, the issue with Crimea is there isn't active fighting in Crimea, and there's active fighting in eastern Ukraine, which definitely changes the equation if Ukraine wants to be admitted into NATO, because you would basically be admitting in a country that is under active invasion, and Article 5 being triggered. I mean, they could trigger it immediately if they wanted to. Yeah, so I think that's probably where it stands right now. I don't think we'll see anything else this year, hopefully. Praying on that. But, Russia just incurred a very large expense to establish something they probably already knew.
The whole thing just seems just so utterly pointless for the cost of it.
I still can't figure out the reason. And, I'm sure people will be very glad to tell us their thoughts in the comments and, what they think the reason is. It's just, we really can't come to a reason at the end of the day.
It's like Russia could, without doing this, the Russian government and their military chiefs and their diplomats could come to a pretty reasonable conclusion of how far they could push things without needing just to incur this expense.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's just confusing. That's all I have to say. But it's Russia, right?
They're gonna do what they're gonna do.
Yep. So let's move on to Carrier Strike Group 21 and the. Okay, all right. I've been following this sort of from the outside, so I can laugh at whatever drama is happening on Twitter without really having a stake in it. Obviously, I do sort of have a stake now. Marines getting deployed to the Queen Elizabeth to operate F-35Bs. But it is sort of funny just to watch from an outsider's perspective.
So we've had the strike group depart off into the English Channel as part for its eventual deployment through the Mediterranean into Asia. But first, it's going off to Scotland for exercise Joint Warrior, where it'll be taking part in the Strike Warrior element of that, which will be bringing some various tests and demonstrations of equipment, ensuring they're all working as expected, ready for the group. And then we'll eventually see it come back round and head head off through to the Mediterranean, where it'll gonna link up. First of all, it'll be linking up with the Charles de Gaulle carrier on the French making their way back from India. Some joint operations and training with them. And recently announced today that it was when it gets towards the Eastern Mediterranean, the F-35s will be taking part in Operation Shader. We did have F-35s take part previously, a few years ago, where they took part by providing reconnaissance from Akrotiri, but this will be the first combat missions launched off the carrier.
Yeah, and round about the same time as the F-35s are taking part in Operation Shader over Iraq and Syria, we've now had confirmed as well this evening that the Dutch frigates, along with 2 of the Royal Navy escorts, will be detaching from the carrier strike group in the Mediterranean and making their way into the Black Sea.
I certainly think
mainly as a sort of warning to Russia in light of recent events.
Because as far as I was aware, that it was going to originally be 1 Royal Navy ship would detach to go to the Black Sea, but it seems to have been upgraded to 2, and now, obviously, the Dutch.
Yeah, the Dutch have confirmed this evening that their frigate will be going with the Royal Navy into the Black Sea, part of that NATO task force, as well as making various stops along the way after that in India, Indonesia, Singapore, South Korea, and Japan.
And obviously, we've had the aircraft that beginning to embark from. Well, they were embarking on Saturday when it left with the Merlin HM2s for ASW onto the carrier and the AEW Merlins. The escorts have all had their Wildcats moved onto it, and yesterday, some of the US Marine Corps and some of the F-35s from 617 Squadron have joined.
Yeah, I believe the rest of those jets have, or most of the rest of those jets have touched down today. We've had some wonderful photos and videos coming from various Royal Navy photographers on board.
I think possibly all of the USMC ones are on board, and I think there's just a couple more British ones to come.
And while we're on this topic of the US Carrier Strike Group, I just want to mention something which those of you who follow me on Twitter will have seen. I made a bit of a fuss about it on Twitter the other day. There was an article by the Daily Express which just blew my mind for all the wrong reasons.
For the lack of brain cells present.
Yeah, I can't even begin to just explain how much pain it caused me in my soul. But I just wanted to make it absolutely clear for anyone who's listening to this who hasn't seen my tweets but has perhaps read the article. Firstly, yes, there are Russian spy ships near Scotland. No, they have not intercepted the carrier. The carrier is currently in the English Channel, so that's not really what you'd call an interception. Secondly, the carrier does not launch a nuclear submarine.
Oh my god, I remember seeing that. That was the worst thing I've seen.
I'll give the writer of that article the benefit of the doubt, and perhaps they just phrased it really poorly. But it didn't help that one of the photos in the article also had the inscription suggesting that was what they meant. Yes, there is a nuclear-powered submarine as part of the carrier strike group. We believe it's one of the Astute class vessels. We don't know which one because that's part of the operational security. But just know carriers do not launch submarines, nor do submarines launch carriers, as someone then replied to me in a tweet, and I just thought, nope, let's not have this argument now. Seriously, guys, just be aware that even the mainstream media is inherently rubbish when it comes to defence news. I have to admit, this is probably the worst article I have read regarding defence in a good few years now. And I do hope that the Express consider taking it down, or at the very least rewriting it quite heavily, because it does not help, dealing with fake news and so on when you're pumping out an article that looks as professional as that one did, but makes as little sense as it did.
Well, I understand it's for the love of sensationalism, but Russian spy ships are just a given for basically any NATO exercise, for any NATO activity, any carrier strike group usually is getting trailed by something. I mean, during the Cold War, this was a given. This was a if you're going out with a carrier strike group, there's gonna be a Russian trawler following you. It's freedom of navigation. They can operate outside of 12 nautical miles from any coast. It's just they do this.
It's standard practice. A Russian ship transits the English Channel. It gets monitored by the French Navy and the Royal Navy.
Yeah,
every country's going to monitor a foreign vessel that isn't exactly from a nation that isn't allied to them pass by.
Yeah, the Russians just more like using fixed seaborne assets for intelligence monitoring than airborne assets.
Well, just look at the Black Sea. The U.S. Coast Guard cutters that entered the Black Sea, they were picked up straight away and followed by the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, it's just everyone does this. It's not sensational. I mean, they're basically fishing trawlers. I mean, how are they going to even intercept the striker? Just
intercept is what you keep for what you refer to fighter jets with.
Yeah, are they gonna drop fishing nets in front of the fleet and try to catch them that way? It's overstating the actual reality of the situation for clicks, and it raises tensions. It makes ordinary people think that the Russians are gonna go fight us now. No, they're not. They have they have a few intelligence ships following a brand new UK carrier around. Of course they do.
Yeah,
what I want to add to the about that article you mentioned is just the misconception that people seem to because the carrier strike group has got the Dutch Navy and the US Navy involved, and people seem to assume that's simply down to you don't have enough ships to escort it. People seem to fail to realize the concept of pretty much any NATO carrier strike group that goes anywhere on a deployment will have one to two to sometimes three vessels from other NATO members escorting it. It's just part of the wider training and part of, if you do go to war, that'll probably likely be the case that other vessels will escort your carrier.
This is a brand new format.
It's not even just NATO. When the US carriers are operating out in the Arabian Gulf and pushing through to the South China Sea, it's not unusual to see the Indian Navy supply a frigate or a destroyer to escort. And Japan is the same situation when the carriers are out there. You see the Japanese Navy supplying a destroyer or a destroyer escort, even sometimes a submarine out there as part of that wider battle group.
Well, the Indian Navy are going to attach a frigate to the French carrier strike group for a couple of weeks as part of training while they're there.
Yeah, I think the main thing about the fact that it is a brand new, carrier, that obviously it's going to be practicing interoperability with other NATO, forces and other allies, and that's something you would expect to happen with the first time it sails. NATO, doesn't exactly have, the operating procedures down, perfectly yet, and they're sort of trying to figure it out because it's the first time it's gone out in an actual deployment.
As well, it just brings genuine training and experience that, for example, the Dutch can collect plenty of experience through helping escort a carrier and bring that maybe if they're ever required to escort a US Navy carrier, the French carrier, or the Italian carriers.
Yeah, or God forbid if they ever have to escort, the Queen Elizabeth again. It's
just normal stuff, and it's just such a common misconception portrayed by some, and a Forbes writer was guilty of this by writing an article that I got brought to my attention yesterday about the fact that saying that Britain has no money to operate jets from it and has no money to actually escort it, even though there is more than enough escorts available.
Well, great. Worst case scenario, we'll just park more F-35Bs from the U.S. Marines on it.
Exactly, it's not.
Look, even if the UK had, 0 F-35s, it still wouldn't matter because, other countries at this point, let's see here, Italy is going to be acquiring F-35s for their own carrier. The U.S. has F-35Bs. Are there any other countries that have acquired?
Was not Singapore looking at the Bs, or were they looking at the As only? Also, Singapore doesn't have a carrier, but...
Yeah. I mean, I guarantee you, anyone who's going to be operating an F-35B is going to be attempting to acquire some interoperability training with any country with a flat top.
South Korea's got sort of not carriers but more amphibious assault ships, and they've got plans to purchase the F-35B. Singapore's getting up to 12 F-35Bs.
Yeah. Well, the South Korea also there have been rumblings in South Korea that they're looking to acquire a carrier. Which I know, in theory sounds stupid, but if you actually think about it in practice, being able to separate a large, carrier strike wing, air wing, from, land-based installations that'll probably be attacked by the North Koreans, it starts to make a lot of sense.
Well, a carrier, for South Korea, a carrier is more than just a strike platform. It's a humanitarian and aid relief platform that can be used for. It can be purposed for amphibious assault if necessary.
Yeah.
It can be purposed for helicopter-based assault.
Yeah, Japan's a very similar concept at the minute. They're also looking at converting their helicopter destroyers, as they call them, into light aircraft carriers. And again, they are very much focused on sort of North Korea, the risk that North Korea poses in a direct attack, and also the humanitarian aspect of how useful a carrier can be to them. As you've already mentioned, we've got to remember that part of the world suffers from earthquakes and tsunamis at an alarmingly regular, interval. And that kind of capability is definitely something that they want to continue investing in.
I mean, even in that area, you don't really even have to continue under the pretense of, humanitarian aid. I mean, the North Koreans are, fairly threatening in the region. It is something that has a far from non-zero chance of being utilized in combat. That's one of those few regions in the world where you have that sort of imminent threat constantly hanging over your heads. I love Seoul, but man, it is the target of a lot of guns.
But as well, it's like Taiwan procuring an amphibious assault ship. It's more of a wider move than, obviously, yes, Taiwan isn't really realistically going to be conducting amphibious assaults, but it's a whole wider diplomatic stuff. You can attach it to various navy groups for exercises and other stuff. You can do obviously humanitarian aid to boost your diplomatic standing with countries.
Yeah, and it's that power projection. It's
they can sail that far further and far further afield than they can sail one of their frigates, which they need closer to home.
Yeah, and obviously, of course, they probably, at least Taiwan probably should be putting money into their, F-16 modernization program. The F-16V block, I think it's 70 with a new AN APG-83 radar. Yeah. That's a big one for them. And then, just for them focusing on that right now, Taiwan is sort of a unique situation just because, the Chinese have made it pretty clear that they're going to invade at some point in the near future. Don't know when, but we know they're going to try.
They're going to do it. They're going to probably attempt it at some point. It's like, it's one of the things with Taiwan has to have so much energy, political capital and money focused on just a threat that I don't think any other country realistically faces on the planet.
Yeah, probably South Korea and Taiwan are probably in the same boat there.
They're probably the closest that you could say. South Korea is probably the closest that you could say to Taiwan, because Taiwan has just got, very few countries have a nation the size of China saying, you're part of us and we will have you back one day.
Yeah, one day soon. It's that sort of Damocles hanging over, a small country. South Korea is a bit better off just because North Korea is sort of constantly on the brink of collapse. They sort of wander from one disaster to the next, and not entirely of anyone else's fault at that point. I mean, it's North Korea. Let's not be overly generous to them here. But it all comes down to that legitimacy in naval power projection. That's a big one. the ability to assist other people in the area, that's a big one as well. And just that general ability in any wartime situation to have to the ability to move around aircraft on a platform is huge, from one place to another. And I think it's sorely underrated.
I think it's sorely underrated, and it's quite often it's just like we were saying. It's often widely misunderstood because people just see a carrier as an instrument just for pure offensive operations.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
well,
and
obviously that's an enormous part of its role. It encompasses a far greater variety of roles.
yeah, and at this point, obviously in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation has become a big thing, for a lot of navies, and obviously that's where Carrier Strike Group 21 is going. They're going to be conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea.
The Royal Navy doesn't do those.
Yeah, we don't like
We
that
don't.
term.
We don't. Well, we don't do freedom. We don't even engage in freedom of navigation things. We simply just sail in that through. There's no like specialized like freedom of navigation operations such as going to a contested area, parking an escort or a larger vessel there do to basically signal that it's not your territory. That's not really something to do. Hence, why the entire group's going to avoid the Taiwan Strait.
Well, oh, obviously the Taiwan Strait. Yeah, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about um, Parcel Islands and that area.
They'll be staying well clear of there because it's still not within the Royal Navy's doctrine of what they do.
Okay, I was confused on that. I thought they would be operating in the South China Sea.
They'll be in the South China
Yeah,
Sea, but it won't be.
passing
They'll
it
not.
by. They're
But they
deliberately
won't.
not poking China's,
Okay, gotcha.
provoking China.
I guess I was confused on that point. I thought there was some element of saying to China that they're in our backyard, or yeah, they're in their backyard.
I mean, it's certainly it is a message. It can be seen as obviously it's there in the region where China are active and will be interpreted by the Chinese and certainly by the Chinese media as such.
Yeah, and it's
But the
not as belligerent as the U.S. is.
No, but the Royal Navy's made it pretty clear that it's really focused on the image of they're there to promote, they're there to work with allies and work. They've made it quite clear that they're not for solely against China.
What? Because they'll be lambasted internally in the media as imperialist?
They'll be it would cause more more diplomatic issues if you said we're here to counter China rather than we just happen to be in this area.
Yeah. And I think it's worth remembering this is Britain trying to push the whole global Britain concept rather than trying to start off another trade war with China, which obviously we're looking at the US and we've been keeping an eye on things with that in recent months. I think it goes without saying that at the moment Britain is trying to be slightly more diplomatic about things than the US. Arguably, we shouldn't be.
I mean, we're not exactly known for our subtlety.
No, but admittedly, I think our stance on things has probably been a little too subtle. There's not been as much outcry about certain human rights violations, for example, on the part of the Chinese, as perhaps there should be. But yeah, as Jordan said, it's the idea with the carrier actually passing through that region is mainly to sort of say, we're here, we're back. Say hello to our allies in Singapore and Australia and Japan and so on, but not so much be there as a confrontation to China. It's, to be honest, the only aspect of this carrier deployment which is really going to be aggressive in nature is the short period of time where we're dealing with Op Shader in Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, because previously there was it was never going to be announced that you would have sort of that it would be operational and start conducting actual operations. But obviously this morning, the UK woke up and early this morning it was announced that it's going to be participating in that, which I think is a great opportunity for the carrier to test a great testing ground for it to test how it performs and how all the systems perform when you're working with an active flight deck with live weapons.
Yeah, and we have seen, obviously Typhoons operating against ISIS targets fairly regularly, at least in the Euphrates Valley region.
Yeah.
So I would possibly, suppose that they could try something like that, and it would be entirely possible. It is operating, a bit far outside what normal carrier-borne operations are.
Well, I know the French are busy doing similar operations as part of their mission, but they moved their carrier into the Persian Gulf for it.
Yeah, well, it's a bit easier to operate off the Persian Gulf than flying through Israel, and then further on into Iraq, just because obviously you have a lot of Syrian air defense systems looking very closely at you,
Uh-huh.
and that's not exactly fun. As we saw again a few weeks ago when a long range shot from an SA-5 system ended up being mistaken for a ballistic missile. Yeah, and well, everyone thought, oh, Patriot launch, something big's getting intercepted. Apparently it was just a very bad shot by a SAM crew. But back on to the Carrier Strike Group 21 discussion. So when they're going to be transiting through the Red Sea, this is obviously a question I still have. Were there any specific defense or defensive postures they were going to take about groups operating out of Yemen and the potential for issues there?
I think that's obviously it's a huge concern because we've seen plenty commercial ships and Saudi military ships and other military ships being the victims of attacks as well by them. There's nothing that's been actually said about it, but I think it's probably going to be a safe bet to assume that they're going to probably have all stick to a formation at a pretty high readiness in case anything does happen. And I can't see any fighter activity occurring as the pass through.
Yeah, because we know for sure that Houthi groups have anti-ship missile capabilities.
Oh, they've got the capabilities to hit ships. They've demonstrated that.
Yeah, and they obviously aren't wasting missiles on lower value targets. They're waiting for large stuff to sail through, and the Queen Elizabeth definitely fits the bill there, as a potentially very opportune target to attack. I
do wonder with that subject whether or not we're going to see some sort of clandestine Israeli activity in the region as the Queen Elizabeth passes through, whether that be at the request of the British government asking for just that little bit of extra protection, or whether or not we potentially see, the Israelis
haven't seen them
doing something that they do. Because bear in mind, we've had a couple of incidents in the last month of Iranian and sort of hostile cargo ships being hit by explosions that seemingly were unexplained.
Oh well, we absolutely know the Israelis and the Iranians are in a tit for tat, shipping war.
Happily shooting up each other's cargo
vessels. This isn't something that's even slightly mysterious anymore. We pretty much know what's happening for sure.
But I think to an extent, though, one advantage that obviously potential targets going through that region have is the Houthis are very tied down with quite high intensity offensives in Yemen at the moment.
True, but they do know when and where the ships are going to be. That is, that's a big one. Obviously, the U.S. moves ships through the region with a bit more not secrecy, but a bit less warning into the future, and that'll be certainly something to at least see.
The French came through with plenty pre announcement that that's the route it's going to take, and nothing happened to them. So
yeah,
I think
we might be
the carriers' defenses are more than adequate, I think, to deal with a potential issue.
Yeah, and we might be overstating the threat. That might just be the other issue.
I think it's certainly a threat, but I think at the same time, though, they would have to probably quite balance if they're gonna attack large, high value Western assets. I think they know the response is going to be pretty damn negative for them. That they're gonna have a response.
Oh, absolutely. That is something I definitely expect. Will we see the carrier actively, launching and recovering planes while they transit through the straits there? But I, maybe we're overestimating the threat. It definitely seems like a very opportune target for any group that wanted to make a statement. And we could see what the results end up, being there.
Yeah.
I'm sure the Iranians also, that is the last thing I wanted to hit on. Whatever is happening in Iran right now, that is
what? Yeah, that's you had I can't even pronounce the foreign minister's name.
Zarif.
Yeah, Zarif. His office was raided by the IRGC. Basically, Zarif is one of the at least more liberal individuals in Iran. I know that's definitely
Not saying much.
that's not saying much, obviously, but he's definitely a lot more liberal than members of the IRGC. And the question right now is, are the IRGC operating outside the purview of the elected government, which they usually do with some amount of leeway, but have they just completely bucked the institutional leadership? And elections are coming up soon. They are running a candidate for president. And I'm not saying he's gaslit, but there was a fairly large controversy where during his press announcement, they basically put up a bunch of microphones with a bunch of different names of networks, and like half the networks that were listed came out and said, "Yeah, we weren't at that press conference. They faked our microphones." So there is a certain level of not Manchurian Candidate going on, but there's something interesting here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the IRGC definitely have a level of hands off. A government have quite a level of hands off when it comes to them, and kind of certainly with their foreign operations, they seem to basically take matters into their own hands.
Yeah, and I think they're probably concerned by the chance of a nuclear deal, at least materializing, because that the IRGC thrives off chaos. That is what they like. They like the status quo where Iran has a bunch of enemies and they're able to attack at them. If that goes away,
they thrived off the chaos of the Syrian civil war.
Oh, they love that. That was one of their best.
That's their playground.
Yeah, that was one of their best routes to get government funding and operation. At this point, though, you have to look and you have to say, are they looking to do something that would cause the deal to either fall apart, or are they looking to cause issues domestically and internationally? And at least the raid of those senior government offices, we saw, they seem to somewhat be taking their own tack here, where they're acting even more independent than normal. They're actively going after elected leadership. They're taking action against that civilian side of the leadership. And are they concerned? Is there something materially threatening their power inside the country, and will they take action against that? That's the question at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it's worth saying as well, we've kind of seen this lull in sort of blatant IRGC activity in Lebanon and Israel and Iraq, and that seems to have come to an end in the last sort of 48 hours. Obviously, with the two rocket attacks that we've seen in Iraq.
Those were sort of half-hearted attacks as well.
They do seem to have pulled back on the amount of effort they're putting into these attacks. And again, as you say, that is likely because of the political situation in Iran at the moment. That is obviously more of a focus for them rather than everything else that's going on in the world. And I've obviously voiced my opinions on this on Twitter on numerous occasions. The current deal that is being pushed for by the US and supposedly also by Iran, it's definitely a cause for concern. For anyone who's not familiar with it, the long and the short of it is the US is trying to push for a nuclear deal with Iran, Obviously, there was a nuclear deal, which, so far as we can tell, Iran probably never actually stuck to. Iran is now at the point where it's enriching uranium at an ever-increasing rate and is potentially...
Yeah, it's 60% right now.
And is potentially getting very close now to having weapons-grade uranium available to it. And yet, despite this, the US is seemingly blindly trying to still push for a deal.
Well, at this point, the two options...
not something it's willing to do.
I think the issue right now is that we've sort of come to the end of the rope here, where they are so close to acquiring a weapon that the only real options are either a comprehensive deal that at least sets them back, 5-10 years, where we're kicking the can down the road a bit, versus, risking bombing, Iranian nuclear sites and attempting to stop them that way. There really isn't any in-between position there. They aren't going to collapse, economically or politically before they get a nuclear weapon. We're fairly, certain of that at this point. And you're sort of coming to the point where you really only have two options. Either one is diplomatic and one is and one is fairly violent and will require, comprehensive, deep airstrikes into Iranian territory, which, I mean, I'll obviously wax poetic about the ability of the U.S. military, but it's not something that they would get away with, unscathed, and it would probably provoke an Iranian response, if we were to attack, nuclear facilities in Iran, you would see, the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. You would see, Iranians start to push out through their Houthi militia groups into the Red Sea and start attacking, tanker traffic headed to the Suez Canal. And we saw how bad it was when the Suez Canal was shut. I would not put it past Iran to do some sort of offensive actions to try to repeat that. I
think as well, it's interesting that Israel, as much as it would love for there to be a deal and for there to be peace in the region, it is not committing itself to the US efforts for a deal because it recognizes that there is very little value to the deal that is currently being fleshed out. I mean, at the minute, the US's latest position is effectively that, yes, okay, we'll have a deal, but no, Iran doesn't have to, actually cancel its weapons program, and the US will still go ahead and withdraw the sanctions. And you just think, well, hang on a second, that's just appeasement. That's not actually trying to get a deal that prevents nuclear weapons from being in Iran's control. That's letting them carry on and sort of saying to them, look, you've not responded the way we thought you would, so we're just going to let you get on with it and do nothing about it.
I mean, the main goal at this point with the deal is more to delay than anything. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place at this point, between a very, very costly war. You have three options. Either one, to just accept that Iran gets nuclear weapons and try to counter it then. Participate in a very, very costly war, or try to delay it with some sort of diplomatic action. I think the U.S. is at least trying to go with diplomatic action first before anything else.
I mean, always the diplomatic route is always going to be the first and most advisable option that you'll try every avenue of that path.
Yeah, and that's why they're trying to hash out a deal right now, because again, 5 years of delay is better than, a wide-ranging, horrifying war in the region right as we're coming out of the tail end of, the pandemic, when we all know the global economy is incredibly fragile right now. And a war right now would be just so incredibly damaging.
I do feel, however, that the US position has kind of forgotten, I think it was President Roosevelt put it, speak softly and carry a big stick. And I think to a certain extent, the Biden administration seems to have forgotten to carry the big stick. Seem to just be speaking softly. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Israel, who is repeatedly showing that it has absolutely no issue with sending in, Mossad or carrying out whatever airstrikes it has to do to ensure that this delay to Iran's nuclear program happens.
Yeah, and I'm sure the U.S. is relying on Israel to keep, going forward with clandestine actions to continue to delay the program as much as possible in order to give every country a bit more breathing room in this situation.
So, as we're coming towards the end, I haven't done this for a couple of weeks because it's been a bit hectic, and I haven't really been able to prepare an awful lot for a little while. But I'm just going to run through a few of the sort of news stories that have come out over the last couple of days in the defence world. We've got the announcement today that Egypt has secured a deal with France for another 30 Rafale fast jets in a deal worth 3.9 billion euros. Egypt's obviously already ordered a significant number of the Dassault jets and has been putting them to good use in various internal operations as well as in the sort of primary air defence role that they carry out for the nation. As mentioned earlier, Holland has confirmed that their frigate Evertsen will enter the Black Sea with the 2 UK warships during the visit later this year, and also confirmed for us that there will be port visits to India, Indonesia, Singapore, South Korea and Japan during that deployment. As we also mentioned earlier a little bit, there has been another rocket attack this evening. It's been 2 evenings in a row now. 3 rockets were fired yesterday evening towards Camp Victory at Baghdad International Airport, and then there's been another 3 rockets fired at Balad Air Base this evening in Iraq, both locations housing US troops. We haven't had an awful lot more information about the attack this evening, but yesterday evening's attack, there were no casualties, and one of the rockets was actually shot down by the US CRAM system, according to local sources. Turkey has turned one of its target drones that it's had in service since, I believe, 2012. It's turned this drone design into a kamikaze weapon with a 200-kilometer range. This is obviously the latest in a series of sort of unmanned kamikaze weapon systems that sort of came to the fore in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict.
Yeah, and I have to jump in here because this is an issue that I've been at least advocating or focusing on for a while, but small drones are the future of mid-intensity conflicts and potentially large intensity conflicts in, moving into the future. Especially with countries that don't have as much money for defense funding, packing, several, a couple 100 kilograms of high explosive onto, a $20,000 or $30,000 drone and flying it directly into an enemy tank, that's incredibly cheap. And right now there aren't really any great counters to that, any more than there would be to any other kind of attack. So it's this really cost-effective option at putting explosives downrange, and I think we're definitely going to see that more. Just this more matured suicide drone going into the future, and I think larger countries may start to develop that into, more of an advanced model, potentially with swarming or some other, type of technology sort of building off of it. But right now, it's, field deployable, and we're looking at this, this incredibly, I wouldn't say mature, but well-developed weapons platform that has proven to work, and that's fairly amazing, I think.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, that the simplicity of it, the fact that they are taking what was originally a target drone for, anti-aircraft weapons, and literally just reconfiguring it slightly, fitting it with a warhead, and suddenly it's got a 200-kilometer range and a 5-kilo warhead, and it can cause a serious amount of damage to targets. It's definitely something that a lot of nations are going to need to start paying attention to if they haven't already.
Yeah, and I know Iran is definitely they've displayed one they've developed with a fairly large explosive payload. I think it was somewhere around 100 kilos. It's a fairly fat autonomous drone. But something like that is really threatening to, commercial shipping, to smaller, boats, to land installations, and even to larger ships. Um, Especially once they get, that whole swarming technique under control. I'll let you get back to the news now. Sorry, I had to jump in there with my spiel about, how drones are the future of different forms of combat.
The US Army has announced that it will be conducting an artillery live firing exercise across Europe, starting on the 5th of May and lasting until the 19th of June. The exercise is called Fire's Shock. Will take place, and they've issued a press release to that effect today. As mentioned earlier, the US and UK F-35s have touched down on board HMS Queen Elizabeth, and the ships are all now at sea, preparing to make their way around to Scotland. And I don't know if it's worth mentioning, because I don't think we really worked out quite what was going on with it, but yesterday there was a major fire at a chemical factory in Iran near Qum. I don't believe we've heard an awful lot more about that so far. Do we know if that was just a fire, an accident, or was there something more to that story?
Unknown at this point. From at least 6 hours ago, it was still unknown. I haven't seen anything else come out since then. So as of Monday afternoon, U.S. Eastern Time, that is where we stand.
And last but by no means least, Boeing has confirmed that it is facing $318 million in losses on the program for the US Air Force's future Air Force One, the VC-25B. This comes, according to them, as a combination of COVID-19 and ongoing disputes with suppliers. Two VC-25Bs based on the 747-8 Intercontinental airframes are due to replace the VC-25s based on the 747-400 airframes sometime in the next 10 years.
Yeah, this one was just embarrassing. They were already produced airframes. They were practically finished by the time the U.S. contracted Boeing for it, and it was supposed to be a cost-saving measure, and yeah, that ended well.
And just before we finish, a number of you have been contacting various of us on Twitter and elsewhere, asking when this podcast is going to be moving to other platforms. Obviously, at the minute, we are on YouTube, and this is sort of where we've started out. I can assure you we are looking at getting onto other platforms. It is a little more complicated than we imagined, so that may take a little bit longer, but please bear with us. And we will announce when the episodes go live on other platforms in due course. Anything either of you two want to add?
That's everything from me.
Yeah, I think that is everything. I thank God it was a more quiet couple of weeks. That was a godsend after the last month and change of tensions. It feels a lot better.
So, thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. And from Jordan, myself, Technical, and also, of course, Tom, who wasn't able to join us this evening. Thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you for the next episode in about 2 weeks' time. Bye for now.